Beneath the sands of Giza, where the ancient pyramids have stood sentinel for over 4 millennia, lies a story that archaeologists, historians, and governments have desperately tried to keep buried. What I'm about to reveal to you will shatter everything you thought you knew about one of humanity's greatest wonders. This isn't just about hidden chambers or secret passages. This is about a war that raged in darkness, a conflict so devastating that those who survived chose to erase it from history entirely. My name is exploring the depths of forgotten conflicts, and what I've uncovered beneath the pyramids will change how you see ancient Egypt forever. After months of research, speaking with underground archaeologists, analyzing classified documents, and piecing together fragments of evidence that powerful institutions would rather remain scattered, I can finally tell you the truth about the hidden battle that took place in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the Giza Plateau. But before we descend into those ancient corridors where blood once flowed like the Nile itself, I need to warn you. The story you're about to hear has been systematically suppressed for good reason. What happened beneath the pyramids wasn't just a forgotten skirmish between rival factions. It was a war that threatened to topple the very foundations of ancient Egyptian civilization, fought not for territory or treasure, but for control of something far more valuable and far more dangerous. The year was 2589 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, when the Great Pyramid was nearing completion. But while thousands of workers toiled under the blazing desert sun, hauling massive limestone blocks into position, another kind of construction project was taking place in the shadows below. A vast network of tunnels, chambers, and underground waterways was being carved from the bedrock, creating a subterranean world that would dwarf even the mighty pyramid above. Recent controversial discoveries by Italian and Scottish researchers claim to have detected structures extending over 6,500 feet beneath the pyramids using advanced radar technology. While mainstream archaeologists dismiss these claims as baseless, the truth is far more complex. What these modern scientists may have glimpsed are the remnants of an ancient battlefield, an underground fortress system that became the stage for one of history's most brutal and forgotten conflicts. The war began not with armies clashing in the desert, but with whispers in the darkness. Deep beneath the construction site of the Great Pyramid, workers had uncovered something that should have remained buried. Ancient chambers, older than the pyramids themselves, filled with artifacts and inscriptions that spoke of a time before the pharaohs, before the dynasties, before recorded history began. These weren't just archaeological curiosities. They were proof of a civilization that had ruled Egypt long before Khufu's ancestors ever dreamed of building monuments to their glory. The discovery split Egyptian society down the middle. On one side stood the pharaoh's loyal priests and administrators, determined to protect the divine legitimacy of their ruler. On the other, a growing faction of scholars, workers, and nobles who believed these ancient relics proved that the current dynasty had no right to rule. They called themselves the Keepers of the True Foundation, and they were prepared to fight for what they believed was the authentic heritage of Egypt. What started as theological debates in temple courtyards soon escalated into something far more dangerous. The Keepers began meeting in secret, using the expanding network of tunnels beneath the pyramid construction site as their hidden headquarters. Here, surrounded by the evidence of ancient glory, they plotted to overthrow Khufu and restore what they saw as the rightful order of Egypt. But Khufu was no ordinary pharaoh. The same vision that drove him to build the Great Pyramid also made him a master strategist. When his spies reported the growing rebellion festering beneath his greatest monument, he made a decision that would seal the fate of thousands. Rather than simply arrest the conspirators, he would let them gather in their underground stronghold, then crush them all at once in the tunnels they thought would protect them. The pharaoh's plan was as brilliant as it was ruthless. He ordered his most trusted military commander, General Hemiunu, to secretly map every tunnel, every chamber, every hidden passage that the rebels were using. For months, royal engineers worked alongside the pyramid builders, not just constructing the monument above, but creating a trap below. They diverted underground waterways, sealed escape routes, and prepared the subterranean battlefield for a conflict that would be fought entirely in darkness. The rebels, meanwhile, were building their own preparations. Led by a charismatic priest named Ankh F. Sekhmet, They stockpiled weapons, food, and water in the deepest chambers they could find. They believed their knowledge of the ancient tunnels gave them an unbeatable advantage. They were wrong. As winter approached in 2589 BCE, both sides knew the moment of reckoning was at hand. The pyramid above was nearly complete, its capstone ready to be placed in a grand ceremony that would celebrate Khufu's divine power. But beneath the monument, in corridors that would never see sunlight, two armies prepared for a battle that would determine the future of Egypt. The conflict began not with the clash of bronze weapons, but with the sound of rushing water. Hemiunu had ordered his engineers to flood the lower tunnels, forcing the rebels upward into chambers where his soldiers waited in ambush. But Sekhmet had anticipated this move. His followers had spent months preparing alternative routes, secret passages that would allow them to strike at the heart of the pharaoh's forces. What followed was unlike any battle in recorded history. In the suffocating darkness of the underground chambers, Egyptian fought Egyptian with a savagery born of desperation. The rebels, outnumbered but fighting for their vision of truth, used their knowledge of the ancient tunnels to launch devastating guerrilla attacks. The royal forces, better equipped and trained, responded with the methodical brutality of professional soldiers. The battle raged for 7 days and 7 nights, though in the eternal darkness of the tunnels, time itself seemed to lose meaning. Warriors stumbled through corridors slick with blood, the air thick with the smoke of torches and the screams of the dying. In some chambers, the fighting was so intense that the limestone walls still bear scars from bronze weapons, though these marks have been carefully hidden from modern archaeologists. On the 4th day, the tide of battle turned when royal engineers succeeded in collapsing several key tunnels, trapping hundreds of rebels in chambers that became their tombs. The sound of falling stone echoed through the underground network like thunder, a terrifying reminder that the earth itself had become a weapon in this subterranean war. But the rebels were far from defeated. Sekhmet had prepared for this possibility, and his most devoted followers retreated deeper into the ancient chambers, to levels that even Khufu's engineers had never mapped. Here, surrounded by artifacts from a forgotten age, they prepared to make their final stand. The deepest chambers beneath the pyramids held secrets that both sides had only begun to understand. Ancient inscriptions spoke of technologies and knowledge that seemed impossible for their time. Water systems that defied explanation, chambers carved with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate, and most disturbing of all, warnings about forces that should never be awakened. As the battle descended into these primordial depths, both armies began to encounter things that challenged their understanding of the world. The very foundations of the plateau seemed to pulse with an energy that had nothing to do with the gods they worshipped. In the deepest tunnels, where the fighting was most desperate, warriors reported seeing things that couldn't possibly exist, ancient mechanisms that still functioned after millennia, and chambers that seemed to extend far beyond what any human civilization could have built. It was in these impossible depths that the true horror of the conflict began to reveal itself. As General Hemiunu's elite guard pressed deeper into the ancient chambers, pursuing the last remnants of Sekhmet's rebellion, they discovered that the war they thought they were fighting was merely the surface of something far more sinister. The rebels hadn't just stumbled upon old ruins. They had awakened something that had been deliberately sealed away. The first sign came when royal soldiers reported that their bronze weapons were becoming increasingly ineffective. Swords that had cut through rebel armor with ease now seemed to dull against an invisible force. Spears thrown with deadly accuracy would veer off course, as if the very air itself was deflecting them. The torches that had illuminated their advance began to flicker and dim, despite having fresh oil and new wicks. Hemiunu himself descended into the deepest levels to witness what his men were describing, and what he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a vast chamber carved from bedrock so ancient it predated human memory, he discovered the rebels engaged in rituals that no Egyptian priest had ever taught. They were not just fighting for political power anymore. They were trying to harness forces that their ancestors had wisely chosen to bury. Sekhmet stood at the center of it all, his arms raised toward inscriptions that seemed to writhe and move in the torchlight. The priest who had once served in Khufu's temples now looked more like something from the underworld itself. His eyes had taken on an unnatural gleam, and when he spoke, His voice carried harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate with resonant frequency. The ancient chamber itself defied explanation. The walls bore no tool marks, yet they had been carved with precision that surpassed anything Egyptian craftsmen could achieve. Channels cut into the floor formed patterns that seemed to flow like water, though they were dry as bone. And everywhere, carved into every surface, were symbols that hurt to look at directly, hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and change when observed. But it was the sound that truly revealed the magnitude of what was happening. A low, rhythmic pulse emanated from the deepest recesses of the chamber, like the heartbeat of something vast and sleeping. Each pulse sent vibrations through the limestone above, causing dust to rain down from the pyramid construction site far overhead. The workers above attributed these tremors to the settling of massive stone blocks, never suspecting that beneath their feet, their pharaoh's army was locked in battle with forces that predated civilization itself. The rebels, desperate and cornered, had turned to these ancient powers as their last hope. They believed that by awakening whatever slumbered in the deepest chambers, they could overthrow not just Khufu, but the entire order of the known world. What they failed to understand was that some things are buried for reasons that transcend politics or power. Some secrets are kept not to preserve the rule of kings, but to preserve the existence of humanity itself. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the chamber began to change. The stone walls started to emit a faint phosphorescence, casting everything in an eerie green light that made shadows dance like living things. The temperature dropped so suddenly that the breath of both armies became visible in the ancient air, and from the depths of passages that no human had carved came sounds that belonged to no earthly creature. Hemiunu realized with growing horror that his men were no longer fighting rebels. They were fighting to prevent something ancient and malevolent from breaking free into the world above. The political conflict that had brought them into these tunnels was suddenly irrelevant compared to the cosmic threat that Ankh-F-on-Sekhmet's desperation had unleashed. The general ordered his forces to retreat, but it was too late. The passages they had used to descend into the depths were changing, walls shifting and rearranging themselves according to geometries that shouldn't have been possible. The network of tunnels that his engineers had mapped so carefully was transforming into something alien, a labyrinth that seemed to exist partially outside the normal dimensions of space. In the chaos that followed, royal soldiers and rebels found themselves fighting side by side against entities that defied description. Things that might once have been human, but had been changed by eons of exposure to forces that existed before the sun itself was born. The bronze weapons that had seemed useless against each other proved effective against these ancient horrors, suggesting that the metal itself contained properties that the original smiths had never understood. The battle that had begun as a political rebellion had become a desperate struggle for the survival of everything above ground. In chambers that existed impossibly deep beneath the plateau, Egyptian warriors discovered that their civilization was built quite literally on top of something that had been deliberately contained. The pyramid above wasn't just a monument to Khufu's glory. It was a seal, a massive weight designed to keep imprisoned forces from breaking free. As the fighting raged through corridors that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of physical space, both armies began to understand the true purpose of the ancient inscriptions they had discovered. They weren't historical records or religious texts. They were warnings, instructions left by a previous civilization about how to maintain the barriers between worlds. The rebels, in their zeal to uncover hidden truths, had begun to dismantle protections that had kept humanity safe for millennia. The water systems that modern researchers struggle to explain suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't just engineering marvels or religious symbols. They were part of an elaborate containment system designed to channel energies that existed beyond human comprehension. The precise angles of the tunnels, the specific materials used in their construction, even the exact positioning of the pyramid above, all served purposes that had nothing to do with burial rites or astronomical alignments. In the deepest chamber, where Ankh-F-on-Sekhmet continued his increasingly frantic ritual, the walls themselves began to bleed. Not blood as humans understand it, but a substance that seemed to exist at the intersection of matter and energy, flowing in patterns that hurt the mind to perceive. The priest's followers, those who hadn't already been driven mad by what they had witnessed, began to realize that their leader was no longer entirely human. The forces he had attempted to harness were changing him, rewriting his very essence according to principles that predated biological life. His flesh took on the same phosphorescent glow as the walls, and when he moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around him. He had become something between a man and a conduit, a living gateway for powers that should never have been allowed into the physical world. Hemiunu made the hardest decision of his military career. Rather than try to capture or kill Ankh and Sekhmet, he ordered his engineers to seal the deepest chambers entirely, even if it meant trapping his own men inside. The threat that the priest had unleashed was too great to risk containment failure. Better to sacrifice dozens of soldiers than allow the horror to reach the surface. The sound of falling stone echoed through the ancient depths as massive blocks, quarried specifically for this purpose, crashed down to seal passages that had existed since before human memory. But even as the barriers fell into place, those trapped on both sides could hear something vast stirring in the darkness beyond, something that had been awakened by the conflict and would not easily return to sleep. The final phase of the battle began with a sound that no human throat could produce. From beyond the newly sealed barriers came a resonance that seemed to originate from the planet's core itself, a deep harmonic that made the limestone foundations of the pyramid above crack and shift. The workers on the surface, still laboring to complete Khufu's monument, felt the vibrations through their feet and assumed it was the gods themselves approving of their pharaoh's great work. They had no idea that far below, the last remnants of two armies were fighting not just for victory, but for the right of their species to continue existing. In the sealed chambers, the air itself became hostile. What had once been breathable atmosphere now carried particles that glowed with their own malevolent light, each speck seeming to move with purpose and intelligence. Warriors on both sides found their bronze armor beginning to corrode, not from moisture or time, but from exposure to forces that existed outside the normal laws of chemistry and physics. The metal itself was being convinced to forget what it was supposed to be. General Hemiunu, cut off from the surface with fewer than 30 of his elite guard, made contact with the surviving rebels in the most unlikely of circumstances. A group of Ankh and Sekhmet's followers, led by a young scribe named Keti, had broken away from their leader when they witnessed what he was becoming. These rebels, their political convictions stripped away by sheer terror, sought out the royal forces not for surrender, but for alliance against something that threatened to consume them all. The meeting took place in a circular chamber, whose walls bore inscriptions that seemed to move when observed directly. Here, surrounded by warnings carved in scripts that predated hieroglyphics, enemies who had been trying to kill each other hours before now shared water and planned their survival. Keti, his hands still trembling from what he had witnessed in the ritual chamber, described to Hemiunu the full scope of what Ankh and Sekhmet had unleashed. The priest had not simply awakened something ancient. He had torn holes in the fabric of reality itself, creating doorways between the world above and dimensions that existed according to fundamentally different principles. Through these tears were pouring entities that had been imprisoned since before the first human learned to make fire. They were the reason the ancient chambers had been sealed, the reason the pyramid had been positioned exactly where it stood, the reason entire civilizations had dedicated their existence to maintaining barriers that most people never knew existed. But knowledge of the threat brought with it understanding of a possible solution. The inscriptions on the walls weren't just warnings. They were instructions, left by whatever civilization had originally contained these forces. The symbols that hurt to look at directly were actually technical diagrams, blueprints for procedures that could repair the damage Ankh and Sekhmet had caused. The problem was that following these instructions would require sacrifices that no sane person would willingly make. The ancient containment system operated on principles that modern minds would struggle to comprehend. It required conscious beings to serve as living seals, individuals who would bind their life force to the barriers between dimensions. These guardians would exist in a state between life and death, aware but unable to act, feeling but unable to cry out, conscious for as long as the threat remained active. The civilization that built the original seals had volunteered entire generations to serve this purpose, understanding that their sacrifice preserved the existence of everything they held dear. Hemiunu read the inscriptions with growing dread. his education in the temple schools finally proving useful in ways he had never imagined. The hieroglyphs told a story of cosmic responsibility, of a species that had discovered forces beyond their ability to control and had chosen to become eternal prisoners rather than allow those forces to spread. The pyramid above wasn't built to house a dead pharaoh. It was constructed as a component in a vast machine designed to keep imprisoned gods from breaking free. The general realized that Khufu himself might not have known the true purpose of his greatest monument. The pharaoh had been guided by priests and architects who carried knowledge passed down through secret traditions, men who understood that certain constructions served purposes that transcended individual glory or religious devotion. The entire Egyptian civilization, with its obsession with death and preservation, might have evolved as a cover story for humanity's role as jailers to entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. In the depths of the sealed chamber, where phosphorescent blood continued to seep from stone walls, the surviving warriors could hear Ankh-Ephon Sekhmet's voice growing stronger and less human with each passing hour. The priest was no longer trying to harness the ancient powers. He had become a conduit for them, a living gateway through which they could enter the physical world. His transformation was accelerating, and with it, the barriers between dimensions were weakening faster than anyone had anticipated. The sound of stone cracking echoed through the chamber as hairline fractures appeared in the walls around them. But these weren't ordinary structural failures. The cracks glowed with the same eerie light as the blood seeping from the inscriptions, and through them came whispers in languages that predated human speech. The entities beyond the barriers were trying to communicate, offering power and knowledge in exchange for freedom, promising solutions to every problem that had ever plagued mankind. Some of the trapped soldiers began to listen to these whispers, their minds weakened by fear and desperation. They started approaching the glowing cracks, drawn by promises of escape and reward. Hemiunu was forced to order his men to restrain their own comrades, creating a desperate situation where the living had to guard against both external threats and internal corruption. The ancient forces knew exactly how to exploit human weakness, offering each individual precisely what they most desired in exchange for a single act of betrayal. Keti, the rebel scribe who had broken away from Ankh-Ephon Sekhmet, proved instrumental in resisting these mental attacks. His training in religious texts had given him techniques for maintaining focus under spiritual assault, meditation practices that allowed him to hear the whispers without being swayed by their promises. He taught these methods to the surviving warriors, creating a fragile defense against entities that attacked through consciousness itself rather than physical force. But time was running out. The inscriptions on the walls indicated that once the transformation of a human conduit reached completion, the barriers would collapse entirely. Ankh-Ephon Sekhmet was perhaps hours away from becoming something that could no longer be contained by physical obstacles. When that happened, the entities beyond the dimensions would pour into the world above like water through a broken dam, reshaping reality according to their alien desires. The decision to implement the ancient containment protocol was not made democratically. Hemiunu, as the ranking officer, simply announced his intention to follow the instructions carved into the chamber walls. He would bind his life force to the barriers, becoming a living seal that would hold the dimensional rifts closed. The process would trap him in a state of conscious paralysis for potentially centuries, aware of every moment but unable to move or speak or die. But one guardian would not be enough. The damage was too extensive, the threat too great. The inscriptions called for multiple volunteers, individuals who would form a network of living seals spread throughout the underground complex. Each would anchor a different section of the barrier, their combined will creating a prison strong enough to contain entities that existed beyond physical law. The volunteers came from both armies. Royal soldiers and former rebels stepped forward together, their political differences rendered meaningless by the magnitude of the threat they faced. These men understood that they were volunteering not just for death, but for something worse than death. They would remain conscious and aware while their bodies became components in an ancient machine, feeling every attempt by the imprisoned entities to break free. The ritual was completed as the first light of dawn broke over the Giza plateau above. Those who became the living seals felt their consciousness expand and fragment, spreading through the ancient network of tunnels like blood through veins. They could perceive every chamber, every passage, every crack where otherworldly entities pressed against the barriers of reality. Their sacrifice held, and the dimensional rifts began to close, sealing away horrors that should never have been awakened. Khufu's pyramid was completed on schedule, its capstone placed with ceremonies that celebrated the pharaoh's divine glory. But in the deepest chambers beneath, where living guardians maintained eternal vigilance, the true purpose of the monument continued in silence. The war that had raged in darkness was over, but the battle to keep ancient evils contained would last forever. Today, when modern researchers detect anomalies beneath the pyramids, they may be glimpsing the edges of this hidden reality. The controversial discoveries, the unexplained chambers, the water systems that defy conventional understanding, all point toward truths that powerful institutions still work to suppress. Because some knowledge is too dangerous to share, and some wars are too important to remember, the guardians remain at their posts, conscious and watchful, holding the barriers between worlds intact through sheer force of will. And every tourist who marvels at the Great Pyramid walks unknowingly above heroes whose names were deliberately erased from history, men who chose eternal torment to preserve a world that will never know their sacrifice.